This was 2:30 a.m. this morning. This is the future state of the motion picture industry.
$50-50 by 2020 to get women to get the bigger budgets as well.
It's very, very important that we put the stories in the hands of the people who own those stories.
Good afternoon. I'm Karina Rotenstein. I'm the TIFF Industry Conference producer. Welcome to day 2 of the TIFF Industry Conference. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are so grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. Just a few housekeeping notes. Yes, absolutely. Indigenous rights, absolutely. Couple of housekeeping notes. There's no professional photography or recording in the studio. However, we are live streaming for you, and the talks will remain up on our TIFF Talks channel on YouTube. So any notes that you take and you forget some golden nuggets that are here, you can always go back and read and watch again and share with your friends. And also do keep the conversation going with our hashtags TIFF19, and hello to our audiences tuning in online. So as the industry is really opening up at this moment, a lot of equality-driven initiatives. Here at the conference, we've addressed a lot of these issues earlier today as well. We've looked a lot at behind the lens through gender parity initiatives. We've looked at unconscious bias with gatekeepers in development. We've looked at storytelling. We've looked at collaborating with Indigenous communities and organizations like GLAAD when it comes to LGBTQIA stories, and also film criticism as well. But of course, what ends up on screen is what travels and matters the most. And here we are today talking about casting. This session is co-programmed by TIFF's Rising Stars, and that is our talent development program. We have an extraordinary roster of young talent who are in their boot camp right now, but again, all part of the work that TIFF is doing in this space as well. The thing with inclusion and equality initiatives, that they are real opportunities to discover talent and bring more perspectives to the table, to the writer's room, create richer stories and layered characters, to embrace new audiences, which equals mo money. I mean, this is a business and there's economic benefit to all of these things, and most importantly, to drive social impact. And we all of us have a role to play. So committed to leading this charge with a warm smile and a firm hand is Russell Boast, president of the Casting Society of America, and he leads the organization's inclusion and diversity training and education committees. His commitment to inclusion and diversity has led to numerous roundtables and teaching events and the development of a number of high-profile initiatives, including the biannual Inclusion and Diversity Expo for the entertainment industry. He is also an independent film and television casting director, thus he leads in the field as well. So there's really no better person to guide this conversation, and I'm going to yield the floor to him and to introduce our amazing guest speakers. Over to you, Russell and team.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. I'm from South Africa, not Australia or the UK, just so we can just clear that up right away. But now living in the US for 16 years. So authentic casting, the real world on screen, the exploration of how we as artists and filmmakers can introduce new narratives and create richer characters that further social equality is what we're here to discuss today. And As some of you may know, I have an inclusion and diversity team who are really leaders in this conversation. I always get the credit, but there's some, Stephen, are you here today? There's a couple of our committee members in the audience today who are doing some astounding work within diversity. We led 3 open calls for trans actors, for performers with disabilities, and for MENA actors, Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian actors, at which almost 100 of our members saw over 3,000 actors across the country in the US. And it's kind of mind-blowing for me today to be sitting with the leaders from each of, representative leaders from each of those communities. I'm deeply humbled to be moderating this panel. I've done so much work with you as individuals and have never had you up on a panel together. So thank you so much for your time today. For those of you who are wondering when your open call is going to be, we are doing an open call for senior actors in January 2020. You are welcome. So let me kick off by introducing our guest, Christine Bruno here. Christine is an actor, teaching artist, disability inclusion consultant. She holds an MFA in acting and directing from the New School in New York City. She is a lifetime member of the Artist Studio and of the Actors Studio, sorry, and she sits on the New York local board of SAG-AFTRA. She is the chair of the New York SAG-AFTRA Performers with Disabilities Committee. As an actor, she has worked in film, television, and theater across the US and the UK and Australia. And in addition to her work as actor and a teaching artist since 2005, Christine has served as an expert disability consultant to the entertainment industry, working with artists, industry professionals, unions, guilds, organizations, including ours, the Casting Society of America, across the globe. Thank you for being here, Christine. Azita Ghanizada. Azita is an Afghan-American actor. She arrived in the US as a political refugee seeking asylum during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and soon became one of the first Afghan-Americans to lead a US television series. In 2017, Azita successfully lobbied SAG-AFTRA to include Middle East and North African, MENA, as its own diverse casting category. And this year she can be seen at TIFF, in The Friend, on Ballers, this summer on HBO, and upcoming on Good Trouble on Freeform and Hulu. Thanks for being here. Trace Lysette, who needs no introduction. She's an actress and an advocate, best known for playing Cher on the Amazon series Transparent. She will be seen as Tracy in the STX film Hustlers. Trace advocates for trans and marginalized people from all walks of life in Hollywood and beyond. And then last but certainly not least, Phil Yu, or as some of you know him, the angry Asian man, who apparently isn't that angry unless you cross him, which I will try not to do today. Phil was born in California. He co-hosts the podcast They Call Us Bruce. He is a member of the famous Bloggers List, a Korean editor and founder of the popular blog Angry Asian Man. He has been featured in several media outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, and CNN. The Post called him a daily must-read for the media savvy, which I hope is all of you in this room today. So let's dive straight in here, guys. We have a lot to cover. I want to dive right in and start off with what went wrong. In the spirit of looking to a better future, I think that we can all agree here on this panel that the entertainment business has historically created some harmful and dangerous stereotypes. What happened? And tell us that moment when you were done listening and observing and decided to start doing some advocacy work. And I can just go down the line to start. What was that minute?
That's such a loaded question, Russell. What happened? I don't know if I can necessarily say what happened, except that, for my entire lifetime and generations before me, for all of us, I think, sitting up here, was just a history of exclusion, because this business is and has traditionally been very Eurocentric, white, cisgendered, non-disabled. So any sort of construct of the other was writ large on our small screens and our big screens for generations and generations, right? Even despite the, growing numbers of non-white, cisgendered, non-disabled communities coming, in the world, throughout the world. So, and when did I just, so the second part of that question was, when did we decide to?
When did you decide, when did you stand up and say, I'm done watching this?
I think, I'm one of those people that, people always ask me this question, and it's funny because, like, I never thought of doing anything else but being in the industry in some way as an actor. I started out as a singer, and just acting was a natural extension. So I think I've always been a disruptor. So right out of the gates, with sort of without even knowing that I was a disruptor. And then as I started seeing, I always felt like, oh, as long as I'm good at what I do, and I'm the best at what I do, people are going to recognize that, and I'm not going to be stigmatized or put in a box because of my disability. And as I got older and got more training, I started to realize, well, that wasn't true. It kind of doesn't really matter how talented you are. People are going to judge you and make assumptions about you. And that's sort of when my advocacy, about 16 years ago, I started to say, I'm done with this. I'm going to use my disability as an asset rather than sort of try to slide into the mainstream, which I had been doing, for all those years before that. So I think about 15 years, I just said, okay, it's time to speak up and use my big mouth that I've had since I could talk for good.
Azita, you walked all the way into the SAG building. What got you started?
I started acting shortly after 9/11, and my name's Azita Ghanizada, and people were like, you should change it. I was like, why? No. And every audition room I'd walk into, they'd say, well, where are you from? And I would say, Afghanistan. Wait, hold on, do women look like you? And do you know, terrorism? What about, and I became a teaching moment. So a lot of my career from the very beginning was walking into rooms and teaching casting directors, teaching producers, teaching studios and networks. Okay, how's Afghanistan different than Iran or Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera? And I was lucky because I never played into any of those stereotypes that they kind of pushed me towards. I was like, well, I grew up in Virginia and I worked on Capitol Hill, and that's my essence, that's what I'm gonna do, and I was lucky enough to play those parts. Our community hasn't so much been excluded as it's been included 80% of the time as terrorists on screen. And so when diversity became really important about 5 years ago.
It was so declared.
Yeah. I had just wrapped a show where I was one of the leads with, I worked with Mahershala Ali, David Strathairn, Malik Yoba, and I was this girl from the Middle East who, her religion wasn't part of the story. She was a hero. She, was dealing with everyday things and all this stuff. And coming out of that show, we didn't even know we were doing something groundbreaking. Now that would be groundbreaking. And auditions started to come to me that were very different. Can you wear a headscarf? Do you have, can you put an accent on? And that's okay, I can do that, but it was the majority. And so something had shifted in the quality of work that was coming to me. I was not gonna be hired unless I was willing to begin to otherize myself. And I knew at that moment that something was wrong in the business, something had changed. And it was at a table read for a pilot that I got that the casting directors, who have always kind of been, they're my community in this business, they're our gatekeepers, and they came to me and said, you're considered Caucasian. I was like, excuse me? And when diversity became important, our group did not have a box to check. And so we fell into the Caucasian box. And those normal roles that I used to be up for, I couldn't get anymore. And that's why the roles had shifted for me. And so I was like, well, Afghanistan's part of South Asia, but it's also part of the Middle East, so you can check the Asian box. And the casting director said, you don't have a coalition. We are always profiled as a religious group. You're Muslim. Well, that's not quite true. If we don't know what religion you guys are, we don't know what George Clooney's religion is, why do I always have to fall into a religious box? And so I decided that wasn't good enough for our communities. And I had the opportunity to push us into the Asian box, but that would have left out all of our brothers and sisters in North Africa who mainly play those terrorist roles, and I said no. And I started to gather data, and I found a way, and I began to lobby SAG-AFTRA with a few very committed actors, a queer Egyptian performer, Amin El-Gamal, and Asaf Cohen, who's a Sephardic Israeli performer. And we managed to find a way to negotiate a new casting category in the SAG-AFTRA producers' contracts for 2017. Something people told me would never happen, and it was the first time in 37 years that's happened. So, don't ever doubt what a few committed performers can do when they put their mind to it, is all I'm going to say. And so that was the beginning of this, and now I'm this person. So.
Trace, how about you?
Well, I think instead of like what went wrong, it's more like it was never right.
Right.
And
That's true.
that's just because of who founded Hollywood, really, if you look back and who started it. And it never really reflected humanity. So when we hear this word diversity, I'm like, it's humanity. Like, the fabric of humanity looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't look like Hollywood historically has looked. So I think it's corrective. The diversity movement is corrective because it never truly reflected the world that we live in. So I think we're kind of playing catch up in that way. In terms of when I got fed up, I mean, I've been fed up my whole life. But I think I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a platform. Transgender wasn't even a word when I was transitioning almost 2 decades ago. So it certainly wasn't a national conversation or a global conversation or even a conversation in Hollywood. And so I think for 40-some years now, we've been watching, cis people play us and win awards for playing us in what we call in the trans community trans face. Because it's watching someone try to be, what we know so personally and what we have lived, and it's a caricature of ourselves. So it's just really painful, and I think I got tired of it once I had a platform and made a little headway in Hollywood and decided to come out. I just felt like it was only natural and part of my survival to just speak up.
Cool. Yeah. Phil?
To answer the first part, I think you said, Hollywood has always had a point of view problem in that it's just been focused on this one point of view. And despite all evidence to the contrary, it has always it's always thought that people are only interested in seeing this one point of view. Much to the detriment of like box office and all these dollars that you're losing. I think for some reason there's just this kind of dogged kind of desire to just stick to what was always been the case, So. Until about 5 years ago, of course. When, I think for me, I grew up. I think like all of us, we're here because we love the stuff that we're creating and consuming, and we love this. Like, as much as people complain, we love watching movies, consuming television, just the content that really moves us. And I grew up my parents owned a video store when I was a kid, so I grew up on a really unhealthy dose of movies. Sitcoms and cop shows and stuff like that. But I would watch it always feeling some sense of invisibility in that I would scour the screen looking for an Asian face, someone who looked like me, and then if there was someone in the background of a music video, I'd be like, oh, look, right there, Asian. Like, it was like that a lot. I think when it really, when I think there wasn't a moment where I decided to do something, but when I started to really feel empowered was when I started my blog, and that gave me a voice to be someone who could say, you know, in carving out this little space for myself on the internet and being able to be like, well, here's the things that I feel what I'm seeing, it's not right. And so all the stuff that I've bottled up over the years, I want to, you know, have a place to sort of put that out there and get angry. I don't know. It was just the internet, you know. So the internet is a place. If you're angry, the internet is a pretty decent place for that.
You're allowed to be angry. You know? You're all allowed to be angry. All right. So what is the current status now? We have these inclusion riders. We have calls to action. We have public slaps on the wrists that we're all seeing. What efforts are working and what efforts are not working? Do you think? And I'm opening it to you.
I think the efforts to create more diverse writing rooms and have more diversity in the casting rooms and in the executive space, actually having the efforts to create rooms that look like the world at large, then people can actually tell those stories. I think that that's an effort that always works. Something that I talk about in my trainings is always, you know, there's always people playing in the Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian space all the time. I mean, it's one of the major, you know, it's over-dramatized, but then there's never, ever a single writer or person in that room, and then they barely empower the consultants that they bring on. And so I think that the way that they're really to direct change is to always make sure that if a writer is working in a space that they don't know, to have that space represented in that writer's room and to actually trust and lean on their voices, because Google gives you the most 5 searched things, you know, and most of the time what you're seeing are these very narrow ideas from Google that writers and stuff go and find, and those aren't the real stories. Those aren't the actual authentic narratives that people from those communities and cultures could actually layer onto the stories.
It's very true. You know, especially auditioning for television, particularly network television in the States. You can, if you're going to play a doctor, and I had an audition last week where I was auditioning for a doctor, and there was a particular condition. I didn't know what the condition was, so I just Googled it, and I got in 5 minutes. I don't even think it took me 5 minutes, more like 2 minutes. I read on Google exactly what was on the page. So, you know, if I can do that on Google in 5 minutes, then that means that's what the writers are doing in some sense, rather than really digging in and getting the lived experience of the communities. I will say, I think the thread that runs through all of our underrepresented groups is a lot of the issues that we talked about is just the history of exclusion, right? You were talking about getting the MENA category, and we, in terms of the union of SAG-AFTRA, we still, after 25 years, have been unsuccessful in getting disability as a category. Even though we are one of the 4 protected classes in the union, producers still refuse to put disability on as a category, so there are no hard and fast numbers of how many of us are actually out there working. And as far as appropriation goes, as you were saying, it's the fastest way to win an award in this business is to appropriate disability culture and play a disabled character. That is starting to change in a big way in the last 2 years, but we are still, I think, one of the most marginalized groups in the industry, despite the fact that we are America's largest minority, and I believe also Canada, at about 22%, which is 62 million people in the United States of America identify as having a disability, yet only 5% of characters on television are characters with disabilities, and of that 5%, only 2% are actually played by disabled actors. So that's a frightening statistic. Right. And I'm thrilled to see all of my colleagues from all my other underrepresented groups getting the recognition that they deserve. And I just hope that disability continues on the train and actually has a huge uptick soon.
I think that the casting space, something that's been that works is when casting directors are incredibly open. When there's a role that comes out, it's I think the general way that it's always been since the beginning of time was this is a Caucasian male or female. These roles are whatever, and then after they've looked, and then the quote is, well, let's open it up.
Right.
Oh, what do you mean open it up? Oh, well, it was obviously, white, but now let's look at other people. And so I think that something that really works is this kind of open casting in the beginning, is having somebody really kind of create, in the casting rooms and with producers, kind of not creating the space to limit that character that they're writing. Like, could it be an Asian man? Could it be a Filipino man? Could it be a disabled person? Who's the best actor for it? And I think that that's something that works. And when we see that reflected on television, those shows last. I mean, how long has Grey's Anatomy been out? Like 19 years. People want to see themselves reflected in that way.
It kind of brings me to my next question, which is a tough one. It's the authentic portrayal versus the ability to portray, right? Because actors train and work hard to be able to portray anything. I can be a tree, I can be a house, I can be whatever. Actors can play everything. That's what they train to do, right? So then what's the big deal about using a trans-masculine man in a trans role or a wheelchair? What is the big deal there if an actor's job is to train to be able to play anything? And I think Trace, you
in terms of
definitely brought it up.
Just the trans issue, it's like if all things were equal, maybe we wouldn't have this gripe, but all things are not equal. And so I'm not getting in the room for certain cisgender roles with other ladies that have the same amount of experience. And so at the same time, I don't always look trans enough to get cast in trans roles, or they're specifically written for a Black trans woman, which is amazing, but we have to think about everyone who's marginalized. And so sometimes I find myself in this twilight zone of wondering, well, what room can I get in? And I think that's the thing that trans people are saying, is that, it's not that we would ever tell an actor that you can't play trans, it's the fact that sometimes we don't get the shot to play those bigger mainstream roles as well.
Yeah, and also you brought up the lived experience versus, I know you guys can speak to that. Is it's a lived experience, right?
I mean, I used to say, we're not even allowed to play ourselves, right? It's so, and I think that particularly speaks in today's day and age, and I'm thrilled to see things really changing for the trans community, but traditionally, it was the disabled community and the trans community. You never saw a trans actor even playing a trans character, let alone what we call a nondescript role. Like, as a disabled actor, we spend so much time trying to get in the rooms just to play disabled characters. Right. And it is opening up, and it's largely due to the advocacy of the community and casting directors. Mm-hmm. I think, as you were saying, like, you are our gatekeepers, and the casting directors have been the ones that have looked around and said, something needs to change. This needs to change. We need to get all of these communities into our rooms on a regular basis, not just when we have a role that we need to cast. And I think that's been a real sea change that I see, and I think it's really starting to open up the minds of directors and producers, and
Yeah, I mean, historically, like, we've always been whitewashed. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, even just as recent as Gods of Egypt, Christian Bale and Joel Edgerton, I mean, the entire cast was made about Egyptians, and there wasn't a single Arab in the film, and nobody wanted to see that movie. Surprise, surprise. So, and so when you talk about, like, what's the issue with that? It's like, actually, how hard Disney worked to try to get Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian performers in Aladdin Now, I've got 5 performers with the biggest opening that Disney has had over Memorial Day weekend for the first time. And Disney would not have worked that hard 5 years ago. And so in that space, it's like if you're once you get performers to actually be able to live in the space that you write about them for, instead of traditionally going with the biggest name actor, what you end up seeing is something like Rami Malek, who's, Bohemian Rhapsody is doing tentpole numbers. And that's such an odd thing. And so now I've got a Syrian Egyptian who won the first Academy Award, and then that moves the ball forward. So it's so important to be able to create those opportunities that would normally not be given to even people of their own community. And until that parity occurs, until the balance begins to start, then it's gonna, maybe we'll settle a little bit and things will open. But right now I think we're holding on because we're like, well, when's it our turn at the table? Like, I don't get the same opportunities as that person. And so that's kind of what that little fight is about.
You started off by bringing up a really good point that leads me to my next discussion is origins, regions, countries, dialects, and dialogues. It's a literal minefield of historical research and mapping that the industry may not be ready for. Let's discuss best practices here and how we can navigate that, and if there are times when it's okay to bend those rules or when it's not. Phil, maybe you want to...
Yeah, I think, it's really great that these changes are happening, and there's been a really great effort to address, accurate, authentic casting. But in a lot of ways, there's also been an overcorrection. People are very, very sensitive and very careful, right? It's like, well, if this role, calls for, it's written as a Japanese American actor, right? A Japanese American character. So we must get Japanese. Right. You can only be of Japanese descent. Just bring in, and then everyone else is sort of, a lot of Asian American actors are kind of left out of that. And I appreciate that sort of careful, very careful, evaluation of how you're trying to cast it. But I do think that there's not a lot of sensitivity that went into sort of a sweeping decision like that, Right. And I think that the simplest way to put it, I'm talking in terms of the way I see sort of, at least, I want to go into sort of break down Asian America to you, but it's just a very large group. It's a political category. It's a grouping that is very convenient and inconvenient in a lot of ways. But there is a sense that it matters when it matters, and it doesn't matter when it doesn't. And that means it's a case-by-case basis for every script you see, every world you're trying to create. And that requires sensitivity. That requires people who know what they're doing, and not just a sweeping sort of like, well, here's what I know about, we need to be careful about this thing and this, and then...
It's hard in our communities because it's so hard to find like one Afghan or like the right person that speaks the right Egyptian. So in our communities, that's why I try to be inclusive of those regions. Because, and I've mentioned this before, we don't stop British actors from playing historical American actors because they're, Caucasian. We don't get upset when, I love using Chris Hemsworth as an example, but we don't ask him what part of the South he's from and how much about the South he knows. And we're like, okay, cool, you white, like, let's go.
Yeah.
We give them that benefit, and that's part of the privilege that privilege that they come into the room and can do that. And it's okay if they're Irish and they can play American or they can play Scottish, and they swim in that space. And we're a little holding on tight, but I do think that we have to kind of accept that we're going to merge a little bit in that space because we don't have that many performers at that level, and the ones that are there should get the chance to keep moving forward.
I think, can I just say, interestingly enough, this also happens in the disability community where there might be a role for someone who, say, has cerebral palsy and uses a wheelchair, right? So what ends up happening is the notice goes out. We need wheelchair user who has cerebral palsy. And then, we couldn't find a wheelchair user who has cerebral palsy, so we just went with this non-disabled guy. I'm like, what about all the other wheelchair users who might not have cerebral palsy, but they're wheelchair users? Why do we go from one specific category to completely jump to non-disabled when there's that whole swath of artists in between that might fit in that? And And it's about, again, the history of exclusion, like you were talking about, Trace, is we've been so excluded for so long that you put us in this myopic space, and then if you can't find the maybe 20 disabled actors with cerebral palsy who use wheelchairs that are otherwise appropriate for the role, you're gonna go to your swath of 5,000 white guys who you can just stick in a wheelchair. And so, and that's an interesting conundrum.
Which kind of brings me to Trace. I've heard from trans actors a lot of varying opinions about this, but the ability to pass. And then I saw an interview that you had done where you talked about how it really isn't helping our efforts as a panel sitting up here for actors to pass, and not give the community a voice. Can you speak to that a little?
In terms to pass, what do you mean by that?
Like passing, passable.
Right, no, in terms of living stealthily. Now, I'm very well aware of my passing privilege, and I come from the generation of trans people where I was taught if you could blend, then you did blend, because it was a survival thing. When you're in New York City alone with no family because you've been estranged from them because of your transition, you've lost your job because of your transition, and you've turned to your only resource, which is your body, and you fall into survival sex work, and you have all these strikes against you, and if you can find a way to make from getting to point A to point B on the subway every day a little bit easier by passing or getting whatever surgery is required to quote unquote blend, then you do that. At least you did in the 90s. Now it's a little different, and it's thankfully we've come a long way in terms of accepting people who don't look so conventional and who are fluid or non-binary or just don't pass at all. And I think we're finally seeing the beauty in that. My sister Laverne Cox has a hashtag campaign called Trans is Beautiful, and it's about accepting all things trans, not just things that look like this or are conventional. So I think it's about accepting all kinds of beauty, and that goes way past the trans community. That's just for people and women specifically in general. But I think for me, living stealthily was doing nothing for pushing the envelope forward. And by stealth, I mean just not disclosing my past, because I was getting by and I was trying to exist in this heteronormative world as best as I could. My first acting jobs were not trans roles. And it's only now, like, I guess 5, or I don't know how many years it's been, 10 years into acting and 5 years acting full time, that I've getting back to roles that are not specifically trans, like in Hustlers. It's not even addressed, and it's a breath of fresh air, and I have a boyfriend, and it's like, oops, that's a spoiler. You didn't hear that. But like, that's such a revolutionary thing to see a trans person, with
not have to talk about it.
Not have to talk about it, and God forbid they have a love interest. Like, it's something that we never see. So it's just a blessing to get there, and I hear you when you say you want that for the disabled community too, because it's still a new thing for us, and it's like we are making headway, but we still have so far to go.
And then that role creates so much impact for like a trans person that watches it and sees themselves reflected and doesn't have to, their identity doesn't become everything about that. They don't have to cling so hard onto that identity. It's so important, with, we're talking about names, just having something that works with, for in our space is with producers and writers is when you write a normal character, someone who's a producer or an executive at an office, but they have an other name. They have a culturally different name. It's not Mary Louise, it is Azita Ghanizada, because then kids have come up to me and said, how do you deal with people saying your name? And they've got like tears in their eyes. And so the impact of having those characters that have these complicated, complex names, it's not the norm of what you know, really impacts your audience. Your audience wants to even hear themselves reflected. Same with the Arabic language. I had a little girl at the summit, tears in her eyes saying, I've never heard my language used on film in a way that wasn't violent.
Yeah. Well, Phil, you spoke to this, and you said you were looking for yourself to be represented as a kid on screen. Do you think if we get this right, guys, that we can actually change the world?
I I definitely, I was thinking about the premiere of Fresh Off the Boat a couple years ago, and that was such a, it's so funny. It's like this ABC family sitcom. It's the most conventional thing you can possibly put on television, but it's like revolutionary. And I had, these people just, I had friends of mine who were just like, I'm getting my family together, watch this, we're gonna, and it's like, that act of just seeing yourself reflected in some way is so empowering. It's so powerful. I would have killed to see that when I was a kid. Yeah. And with that, something like the most conventional thing on television, it shouldn't have to hold up an entire community. It's too narrow of an experience of a show, of a story, to hold up an entire community. But with each sort of, it builds on, with each representation, it builds more and more, and it becomes a little bit easier. And then you could have errant, sort of renegade depictions of Asians and stuff like that, where being the villain or being the terrorist doesn't matter as much. Yes. It doesn't hold so much power, right? Where you can have a variety of experiences reflected on screen. You're the bad guy, you're the good guy, you're the nerd, you're whatever,
So great, so great. So I knew we would never have enough time to cover everything, and I do want to open it to the floor for a couple of questions. So let's see if anyone has anything they'd like to ask our panelists.
Right there.
We have one coming down in the front here.
Hello. Okay, hello. First of all, I would just like to thank all of you for being so inspiring and telling us your truth. This is really amazing, speaking as someone who's never really seen growing up herself reflected, and to see someone people like you actually leading the panel is amazing. But my question is for the ones who are working as actors. You mentioned at the beginning how in your acting career you really you were given roles where you were forced to kind of other yourself in order to stand out, or not stand out, but those were just the roles given to you. How do you feel about now in the industry where it's now that we're seeing it's actually possible to see those. You don't have to other yourself as much. You don't have to always have an accent, or you don't have to come from a specific country. You could, because speaking as me, I'm a child of immigrants, but I don't speak my nation's language. I grew up in Vancouver. I'm super whitewashed. How do you, what are the tools that you can use to navigate that kind of dilemma when you're given only those roles?
Well, so here's the thing. It's what's the privilege? If you want to fight to get on screen and you want those opportunities and you want to try to get your foot in the door, then do you learn how to affect the accent? Do you learn how to play those things so that you can actually get yourself and build yourself a little bit of a resume so that you have space to do that? I don't think it's awful unless it's a stereotype and then that really hurts you. I've said no to a tremendous amount of things, and it stopped me from working quite a bit. So I think if you're in the position where you kind of want to do that, then that's great. But ultimately, I think Russell can attest to this. I am who I am, and I bring my whole history and my culture and my presence and everything into the room, and I don't shy away from that. Everyone knows what I'm castable as, and that's as this woman. And so there are times when I can slide into those other parts because I want to. And I'm very proud of my identity. Most of the roles I get are written for a normal person. I have them adjust the name in the last few years to a Middle Eastern reflecting name, even when it's not written that way. So I always want to layer that in there. So, I think that the tool that you have to do right now as you're trying to get your foot in the door is to be open and to befriend your casting community and let them know who you are. Okay, yes, there are parts of me that is this, because as actors, we rearrange ourselves, right? I grew up in America, but my family's Afghan, and I'm very much attached to that culture. So if there were parts that call on that, how do I rearrange myself to get back into the instinct of what my mother might have done or what that was for me? And I lean into that because that is a story that I want to tell that does live inside of me through generational culture. So I wouldn't be scared of diving into that side of you and that aspect of you, playing with it. But if it's, all you get, then you have to create your own opportunities. And those are abundant now.
For me, it's been a question of because opportunities for disabled actors are still pretty few and far between, I have to ask myself serious questions. I've turned down work as well, but then I also have to go that extra step and say, okay, so if I turn this down, does it mean that what's going to happen is what I said 5 minutes ago, that they're going to go to some non-disabled person to play this role? So I have to have a conversation with myself. Can I bring something to, although I might not be crazy about it, can I bring something to the role that's going to inform it in a way of my lived experience? So it's going to give agency to the disabled character that it wouldn't have if it went to a non-disabled person.
Cool. We have a question out here. Yes.
This is for Azita. Sorry, I'm going to try to get through this because you made me cry from like the beginning when you started talking, because I'm an Arab Canadian actor as well, half Lebanese, half Syrian, and going through auditions of refugees and sister of a terrorist and wife of a terrorist. And it's great now that you've created like that box that we fit into, but do you see the characters being written, like, do you find them changing now? Because I haven't here in Canada.
I do think that there's an opening up to seeing members of our community in different way. Like what Phil was saying, it's not going to disappear. Those stereotypes are still going to play, but it's in our positions to say we have to have balance. I know you're going to still write terrorists. There are still shitty terrorists in this world. Like, we're not going to stop writing about them. But if you only have that as our community's guide point, then you're really creating a dangerous narrative. If 78% of white men played mass shooters or neo-Nazis or slave owners, then our world would be in a lot of trouble if that's all the images that we saw of white men. So you can't continue to do that to our community. So if there's some balance, I think it's happening a little bit now, but those roles come. And, you know, I know that that's really prevalent right now. It's such a tricky thing to navigate because you have to do what's right for you. And if you're a comedian, then I would lean more into playing into that comedy aspect of yourself and away from these terrorist narratives that are coming to you. Because eventually they're going to run out of actors that are willing to play these things. Mm-hmm. And I don't care if, you know, a white person plays the terrorist. Great, more power to you.
Thank you.
Cool. We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm actually Mace's talent agent, and I have actors quit almost every day because they can't get other roles. And actually the other day, one of my actors, he's Indian, he's like, Lisa, I keep getting cast for the cab driver. I'm so sick of it. But like, how can we start from the very beginning of the process? Because I see the casting breakdowns, and they're borderline offensive. So how do you think that we could start just from the beginning of the descriptions, and how do you think we could fix that process?
Well, I mean, I think maybe you did too, but we helped write kind of like breakdown guide points for the casting directors, and I think that that's a call on the casting community to listen to a little bit of that feedback. Sometimes I know producers can really twist the arm that they want things a certain way, but I do think that, you know, as we sit in these rooms and we put this out in the live stream and we're talking to decision makers, and the more and more we talk to them, the more we can kind of push them in a direction away. And as an agent, that one breakdown that is offensive, I would avoid, you know, pitching your client for that and pitch them for the lead and keep on pitch and keep. Why don't you see them this way? Why don't you see them this? Why don't you see them as this best friend? This isn't what they are. You got to get my guy in the room. Like, and you just, you know, maybe that casting director will stop answering your call. Maybe one day they'll give him a chance. I don't know.
Yeah. Cool.
Hi, I just wanted to make a point about who started Hollywood. Actually, women started Hollywood. Mm. You know, we kind of lost control of it at some point. There's a really wonderful film about Alice Guy Blaché, who was one of the early filmmakers. It's called Be Natural, that explains a lot of that. But I also wanted to ask you, because when I, as a writer, when I'm creating characters, I actually think a lot about blind casting and who can be cast in the role. And I try very much to not get locked into an idea, because I feel like turnabout is fair play. And in that so many straights have played gays, I don't see any reason why gays can't play straights. And I have a role that I would really very much like to talk to you about, Tracy.
Oh, I'd love to talk to you about any kind of role.
Well, it's a woman who thinks she's Blanche Dubois. She's in an institution.
That's cool.
I love Blanche.
I do too.
Let's talk.
We will.
Yeah, when I was referencing like the beginning of Hollywood, I was just thinking about like Warner Brothers and Paramount. And,
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have anything else? Yes.
Hi. Thank you guys so much. This has been amazing, and I'm so happy that I got to hear all of you talk. I have a production company that focuses on hiring women behind the lens, and for me, it's been really important to see, like, to build sets and build a collaborative experience that includes and represents the people who are being cast, so that it creates a safe environment to bring things up like adjusting your name to better reflect your character, that you are an individual and, you know, affecting yourself. So I guess I'm wondering if anyone has had any experiences on set where you see yourself reflected in the people behind the lens, and if you haven't, you know, how would that make you feel if you did, as talent, show up and the other people in collaborative positions looked like you, or, you know, reflected you, and how would that create a different environment on set compared to what you have experienced?
I can speak for myself. No, very rarely. I think I've done 1 or 2 films that have had more than just a smattering of disability representation. By a smattering, I usually mean me and maybe someone else. So yeah, and just obviously being with my community behind the lens, that just creates a support and a safety, and I think probably we would all say that. And also shorthand, because one of the things that I'm hearing from everybody today, and I often talk about, is the expenditure of emotional labor, because we all have to wear at least 2 hats when we're doing things, because it's sometimes I just want to show up and do my work, but I'm always forced to be the educator in the room, and I don't mind, because I have the knowledge, and I'd rather you all have the knowledge as well, that I can, you know, that I can share with you. But it is sometimes taxing when I just want to show up and be the actor and do my job.
Cool. And we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi. Thank you all for being here today. Everything that you said has been very inspiring, especially because I'm a film student, and hearing what you've accomplished has been very inspiring. So my question is just, I wanted to hear what your opinion is on colorblind casting, especially when it's done on existing, like a book or something that, you know, previously existing work, and then they race bend a character. I just wanted to know what your opinion is of that.
I think colorblind casting, as we understand it, is a very noble sentiment. When it trickles down the way and it's not carefully sort of guided down the process, colorblind usually ends up sort of benefiting the same people it traditionally been cast, I think. So it needs to be, I think a lot of times, it really has to be specified, and you have to work towards, like, this is my vision for this, and I want this to happen. I think that a lot of the times, we just expect, things will just work out in the end if we just say, like, open it to everybody. A friend of mine, he's a writer named Zichan. He shared an image of a screenshot of a script that he wrote recently, and he said, I've been waiting my entire life to write this. And he says, in parentheses, all characters are Chinese unless otherwise specified. Mm-hmm. And I was like, he posted that, like, I almost cried. It was so awesome.
There's been like some swapping, right? Didn't Dev Patel just play David Copperfield or something? Right. And that's just something new, like there. And I think one of the it just got some press. And so, I think Hugh Laurie had a really great statement about that. And then we've got an African-American Little Mermaid. And yeah, and I think that the thing, in those kinds of swaps is that for so long, it's been one image, right? For so long, it's been one image. There's so many people in this room that are here with tears in their eyes saying they haven't seen themselves reflected. And so I think right now, if you can swap in that space, like Idris Elba played a Norse god, and everyone was like, "This is our Norway story. How is Idris Elba?" And it's like, well, for 1,000 years, you guys have put on, been painted down and put on Asian face and all of these different things, and you all played Egyptian gods. I didn't get a chance at any of that, So it's like in that space, it's like until we get to the place where we balance, I think it's okay to live in that space a little bit.
I'll wrap up by saying when you do it, and you take a classic like Oklahoma and you put a wheelchair user in a performance of Oklahoma, that wheelchair user wins a Tony Award, is what I'll say.
Yep.
Thank you so much, guys, for being here. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to
Also, Hamilton.
Thank you all so much for coming this afternoon. What an amazing conversation. And this is definitely worth rewatching and sharing, so please do. Come back at 4:30. We're going to talk all about directing in our session called All About Directing TV. So voila. Thank you.